So tell me about the Saints. Some moves about this salary cap with the restructuring and some of the losses so far. One of them that really hits me was Kaden Elliss because I thought this guy was a playmaker. I hate to lose him.
Yeah, so they obviously did all those restructures. I think there were 9 of them in total. Marshawn Lattimore, Alvin Kamara, and Cam Jordan were the final 3 that hit yesterday to get to cap compliance, and that's kind of the first step for the Saints every offseason is getting under the cap so that they can go into the league year without losing draft picks and stuff. Mm-hmm. Then beyond that, the Saints lost 4 free agents yesterday. And if you're a fan of the comp pick formula, that's a good thing in terms of maybe you'll get a couple extra draft picks next year. But yeah, there was a few that probably hurt, right? So Kaden Elliss and David Onyemata both went to the Falcons. That's not a surprise per se. Ryan Nielsen, who is the Saints, obviously their former co-defensive coordinator and defensive line coach, is now the defensive coordinator with the Falcons. So it was to be expected that he would kind of come for some of his former players, and that's exactly what he did. Kaden Elliss signed a 3-year, $21.5 million contract, which, this is a guy who was a 7th-round draft pick back in 2018. This time last year, I don't think anyone even was sure he was going to make the roster, let alone start 11 games and sign a huge deal. So that's a massive day for him. And he's now, I want to say, the 13th or 14th highest paid inside linebacker in the NFL. David Onyemata signed a 3-year, $35 million contract, which is a steep raise from the 3-year, $26 million contract the Saints had him on. So one theme of this offseason for the Falcons is they have a lot of cap space, and they are not shy about using it. Because I would say both of those deals, I think both of those guys the Saints would have wanted to bring back, but at nowhere near those numbers that the Falcons were throwing around.
Marcus Davenport, where'd he go, and what's your exit interview on Marcus Davenport?
Yeah, he went to the Vikings on a 1-year, $13 million deal, which that's a big number. It's a 1-year kind of prove-it deal. Marcus is frustrating. Obviously, he had all that draft investment, and I was hoping that the Saints were going to try to find a way to keep him around just because I think there's so much untapped potential there that we've seen flashes of, and it's what the Vikings are going to try to get this year. And when you have that much draft investment in a guy, they traded a future first, which was the 2019 first-round pick, to move up in the 2018 draft to get him at number 14. It's really frustrating to see that guy leave after his rookie contract. But, he never was able to stay healthy. This past year he actually was, and he ended up with 1.5 sacks throughout the course of the season. Hopefully he can find his way out in Minnesota. I think he did always play hard. It just didn't always work out for him.
What about Shy Tuttle?
Yes, Shy Tuttle's another interesting one. I didn't expect him to get the deal he got. He signed a 3-year, $19 million contract with the Panthers, which is, if you know Shy Tuttle, he's from North Carolina, so it's kind of a homecoming for him. And I didn't think the Saints were going to have much competition for him, if I'm being honest. He's been a solid player. Saints fans will remember him for years to come for that gift farming Matt Ryan into dust on Thanksgiving. And I don't know if I think the Panthers really paid above his market, but he's going to be another guy. And when you look at these names leaving, there's a clear theme here, which is, a lot of the pass rush from last season is out the door. Kaden Elliss had 7 sacks. David Onyemata had 5 sacks. And you're going to have to rebuild that defensive line, particularly the interior defensive line. Right now, the Saints don't have a single defensive tackle on their active roster.
Wow.
They have one on the practice squad. I think his name is Prince Emili, which I don't think anyone's ever heard of him. So they're going to have to do something. The good news is that's really the only position, the defensive line, that kind of got ravaged in free agency, right? The Kaden Elliss, while you wanted to keep him around, one of the issues that came in paying him was how does he get in the field, right? You have Demario Davis and Pete Werner. He's going to be your starting Sam linebacker, but you really don't use that position that often. In the modern NFL, most teams only run out 2 linebackers at a time. They use sub packages, dime packages, nickel packages. So paying $7.5 million a season for a guy who is essentially depth is a really tough scenario. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately for the Saints, he played so well that he played his market out of their range.
So how do you do it? How do you now rebuild a defensive line with players as good as or better than you couldn't afford?
Well, see, I don't even know if it's about couldn't afford it. I don't know that the defensive line was necessarily a strength last year, mm-hmm. right? Like the defensive interior definitely wasn't a strength.
Well, no, but
you have a new defensive line coach.
What I meant was you're either getting better or you're getting worse. So for whatever reason, the market value drove them away or lured them away.
The market value ballooned on David Onyemata and Kaden Elliss, because Ryan Nielsen wanted his guys.
I got you.
Right?
In Atlanta.
That's a factor there. I don't think
right.
David Onyemata is getting 3 years, 35 from anybody else. Right? I don't know if Kaden Elliss is getting 321.5 from anybody else. I think Terry Fontenot and Ryan Nielsen are sitting in there. They're like, we drafted these guys. We're going to get these guys. And that's where you go. But I think the Saints, you're going to have to look hard early in the draft and get some defensive tackles, defensive ends. You have some money to throw around. You can bring in depth here. Todd Grantham is the new defensive line coach. I think he's probably got some shortlisted guys that they're going to take a look at. And I think you're going to see over the next few days how much space the Saints can and decide to free up and what their targets are going to be. But I do think the Saints are going to slow play this to some extent. I don't think they're in any hurry to tilt and try to bring in guys just because, oh no, our roster has been depleted at this one position, right? They're going to take their time. Out of these guys, I didn't think anyone but maybe Shy Tuttle would be back. I thought they were going to try to bring David Onyemata back, but it was going to be tough. And so, yeah, you're going to have to figure that out.
That's a great point about Nielsen driving the price up in Atlanta. What about the draft and where the Saints got a number 1 pick now? Is it likely they would go after a defensive lineman? I don't know what the draft class is like for those, and how do they factor what's going on now with soon-to-be free agency, with the draft, who would be available, et cetera? How do you see all that playing out? What are you hearing?
Yeah, you never want to have to draft for need, right? You never want to be like, man, we really desperately need defensive tackles, so we have no choice but to take the top defensive tackle on the board. But I think in this case, you're going to have a higher value on defensive tackle in that first round. So if a guy like Brian Brzee gets there, maybe a Mozzie Smith out of Michigan, Siaki Ika is an interesting guy out of Baylor. You know, there's going to be a lot of options that they can look at 29 and 40. And I wouldn't be surprised if you take defensive tackle at both 29 and 40. Mm-hmm. One of the complaints about the Saints is that they have been handing out contracts too flippantly, that they haven't been more judicious and brought in young rookie talent from the draft, and that's probably going to be the route they go to really kind of rebuild the defensive interior, which they haven't been aggressive on in the last few drafts. So you haven't seen them spend a lot of draft capital on the defensive interior. It's been one of my critiques of how they've drafted the last few seasons. So I think that's where you're going to go, and then you're going to see it. I think Cam Jordan put out a mock draft. He's been very, very active on Twitter. He's on vacation. He's having a good time. And he had him taking defensive tackles the first 3 picks, which I did find amusing. At the time, it was like, what a silly guy. And now it's like, man, they might actually do that now that you kind of see the state of things. But, I mean, again, you look at the state of the roster, and that's the one real position that you see holes at. And then outside of that, there's a pretty solid baseline of the players returning. You obviously have the quarterback situation figured out. You're bringing Juwan Johnson back. J.T. Gray was re-signed. Tano Passanio was re-signed. Calvin Throckmorton and Keith Kirkwood were re-signed. And Jameis Winston, did I already say Jameis Winston? He is going to be the backup quarterback. He agreed to terms on a reduced deal, which was a surprise to me. He must not have felt like his market was going to explode or kind of find an opening for a starting job. So he's going to stick around as the backup on a reduced deal, which does help the Saints because they were able to save more against the cap, I believe, by doing that than they would have by cutting him.
Restructuring Alvin Kamara takes all the talk away that he would be traded.
Yeah, one of the difficulties of the restructuring kind of method is it does make players more difficult to trade. I don't know if you were ever going to trade Alvin Kamara this offseason, just because I don't know if his value is ever going to be lower than it is right now, not knowing what the outcome of this court case is going to be, right? Like, what team is willing to kind of pay at the top of his market at all if they are wondering, you know, how long is he going to be suspended, right? What's going to happen with this? So, yeah, I never really felt like that was much on the table at all. But, yeah, anytime you're restructuring players, you are intending to keep them around. And because one thing that we see with David Onyemata this upcoming season, and it is kind of the complication of doing this whole restructure pattern, is you add these void years to contracts. And when these guys leave, those void years kind of evaporate. They disappear. And then that dead cap hit advances to the upcoming season. So because they were unable to sign David Onyemata, he is now going to cost them $10 million against the cap this upcoming season because that's his dead cap charge. Mm-hmm. So it makes things a little more complicated as you kind of look at, okay, you know, do we want to re-sign this guy or do we want to accept this cap hit, right? Or do we want to trade this guy? And that's kind of where you're at with a lot of these players, and it's the complication you run into when you manage the cap the way the Saints do.